Hour-ish online today. Hi, I'm the weight loss champion, Chuck Carroll. Thanks so much for taking a little bit of time out of your day to join us here on Facebook and YouTube. On tap today, a big show. Talking about there are more signs that more of us are going vegan. So we'll tell you about a new study showing the surprising number of people who are turning to plant-based meals during the pandemic. And what's the best way to make those homemade masks that you see everybody wearing? We've also got details on a study showing the best materials that offer the most protection. Both of those stories plus headlines in 5 things you need to know. And Dr. Neal Barnard is here with us today to talk about high blood pressure. More than 100 million Americans have it. He's here with why that is such a big deal right now and how changing your diet can bring that high blood pressure right under control. And you know that whole idea about putting on weight during the pandemic, that whole COVID-19 pounds thing? Well, you can forget about that because dietitian Karen Smith is here today to share with us some tips on how you can actually lose weight during the pandemic. What a novel idea. Karen, thank you so much for joining us. Look forward to speaking with you in just a little bit. And we're going to be opening up the doctor's mailbag to answer your questions. Okay, today is the extended version. So Dr. Barnard and Karen, they're going to be here to get to as many of your questions as they can possibly answer by the end of the show. So if you have one, go ahead and post it in the comment section right now. And like I said, we will do our very best to get you an answer before we sign off today. But we do start today with 5 things you need to know. Here are the headlines for Wednesday, May 6th, 2020. Nearly 1 out of every 4 people are eating more vegan and vegetarian meals because of the pandemic. And that's compared to just 11% who say that they're eating more meat. The latest survey appears to show a change in eating habits as people explore the link between animal agriculture and the virus. The Self-Inc poll also reveals a growing number of people who are spending more time in the kitchen and experimenting with recipes. Homemade masks are increasing in popularity, but do you know the material that is best for preventing the spread of the coronavirus? Well, according to a study published in the journal ACNS Nano, the answer is a combination of 600 thread count cotton paired with chiffon that's made out of polyester and spandex. The researchers concluded that the combination can filter out between 80 to as much as 98% of aerosol particles, but they say poorly fitting masks with gaps around the mouth can erode the efficiency by as much as 50%. In other news, a group of British scientists are setting out to find what effect the lockdown is having on dementia risk among older populations. Researchers at the University of Bristol hypothesized that stress from COVID-19 is disrupting sleep and in turn adversely influencing brain health. As many as 5,000 people will have their sleep and circadian rhythms tracked, along with stress and anxiety levels, to see how that relates to overall brain health and the progression of dementia. And Vice President Mike Pence says the White House Coronavirus Task Force, created to fight the spread of COVID-19, appears to be in its final days. The collective, which includes a number of the nation's top health officials, will likely begin to be phased out between Memorial Day and early June. Pence cites the, quote, tremendous progress we've made as a country as the reason the task force is being disbanded. Meanwhile, the rate of new cases of coronavirus in the U.S. is expected to climb sharply in the coming weeks as states begin lifting restrictions. Multiple models now projecting between 100,000 and 200,000 new cases and as many as 3,000 deaths to be recorded each day, a number that could quickly eclipse the 100,000 total fatalities forecast by the White House over the weekend. The death toll in the U.S. already stands at more than 71,000. Time now to welcome Dr. Barnard back to the exam room live. And Dr. Barnard, let's talk about high blood pressure. At least 1 out of every 4 adults in the U.S. has it, and it's one of the leading risk factors for COVID-19, turning a bad case into one that can be deadly. But high blood pressure is also something that we have a lot of control over by changing our diet. What can you tell us?
You're absolutely right. High blood pressure is really one of the huge problems. Back at the very beginning of the pandemic, Chinese researchers said many people are getting sick, but a huge number of them who are especially sick have hypertension. Let me share, if you don't mind, my screen. I want to walk you through this, but before we do, actually want to give you another headline that just came on as we were coming to air, and I want to share it with you. Okay, can you see that? This is the COVID-19 virus. And what I wanted to share with you before we get to blood pressure, do you see those yellow spikes that go all around? Those spikes are where the virus will attach to you. You inhale the virus, those spikes will attach to your lungs. What just came out, a new report that there is a new strain of COVID. There are many new strains. There's apparently have been about 14 different mutations of those yellow spikes. Each time that happens, it means it's another variant that may or may not be recognized by the immune system and may or may not be targeted effectively by a vaccine. So it makes it much, much stronger. But the point I wanted to make is that the virus originated in late December, maybe early December, depending on what you believe. But it was in February where this new variety came in, much more virulent. It has the name spike D614G. That's a name for that yellow spike. It circulated around Europe, is now in the United States. It quickly became the dominant form and is worse than the form that apparently originally arose in China. Here's the reason that I'm mentioning this to you. You get more than one version in circulation. And that means two things. One, as I mentioned earlier, it means that the immune response can be complicated. Making a vaccine can be complicated. It can mean that you got it once and you'll get it again because you're not immune to the new one. But more worrisome than all of that is that if you get more than one variant in circulation, they can, so to speak, get married and reproduce. So their progeny is a whole new virus that has never existed before. It's something called recombination. We've seen that with influenza viruses, and so their progeny may be less virulent, could be more virulent. Stay tuned, but this is not good news when it comes to the idea that a vaccine will make us all safe. Okay, now that I've cheered everybody up, let me jump back into blood pressure. We talked earlier about this question of blood pressure, and when the researchers noticed that high blood pressure was strongly associated with COVID-19 infections, and especially the bad, potentially fatal infections. The attention first went to the blood pressure medications, ACE inhibitors like lisinopril and ARBs, angiotensin II receptor blockers. These are the most common drugs that are used to treat blood pressure. And in your body, they cause the body to make what's called the ACE2 enzyme, which is the welcome mat for the virus. So the alarm went out and said, if you're taking these medications, you're inviting the virus into your body. Other researchers said, no, you've got it all wrong. These medications actually have a protective effect, and they can help stop the virus. So what's the truth of all of this? Well, brand new. We've got a new article just out in the New England Journal of Medicine. A large group of people brought in thousands of folks who had not only hypertension, but also had COVID-19. Did they find that taking an ACE inhibitor was harmful, or was it helpful? The answer, neither one. It didn't do anything. It didn't help them. It didn't hurt them. It had effectively really no effect at all. Sorry, hold on. My screen is somehow magically frozen up. Okay, now we're back. Okay, so what this really means is, for now, we really don't know what to make of the blood pressure medications, except that there does not seem to be any strong evidence that they're harmful or that they're helpful with regard to COVID-19. If you're on them, keep taking them, and at the same time, bring diet back into it. Here's why. Let's go through the numbers. If you have high blood pressure, it can affect your brain, making a stroke more likely. It can affect your heart, making a heart attack more likely. It can affect your kidneys, making kidney disease more likely. And so our target is 120/80. What does that mean? Well, that top number, the 120, that's systolic. That means your heart is squeezing, it's beating, and your blood pressure rises to 120. And then the second number, just diastolic, that's between the beats. So your heart squeezes and then it relaxes, squeezes and relaxes, and your blood pressure goes up to 120, down to 80, up to 120, down to 80. And your doctor or nurse or caregiver will check both numbers because you want your top number, your systolic, to be below 120 and the bottom number to be below 80. You want them both under those targets. If you've got a good systolic but a bad diastolic, no good. You want them both down under the target. Okay. So you've got high blood pressure and your caregiver is going to say, stop consuming salt or cut down on salt. Good idea. Because salt does bring fluid into your bloodstream that raises your blood pressure. So there also is sodium in foods naturally. An orange has about 1 milligram of it. An apple has 2. Brown rice, cup of brown rice, 20 milligrams. A potato, 13. Potato chips, 330. So big difference. This is a processed food with a lot of sodium added. However, go to the store and take your potato chips over to the cheese aisle and read the labels together. And what you discover is that cheddar cheese has more sodium than potato chips. And if it's eaten, more still, 500 milligrams of sodium in a 2-ounce serving. And the granddaddy of all of them, Velveeta, 800 milligrams of sodium in a 2-ounce serving. Yep, it's enough to make the top of your head blow right off. Okay, so also, it's not just the cheese on top of that burger that's a problem. It's the burger itself. Here's why. If you're eating not just sodium, but if you're eating fat, especially animal fat, your blood becomes more viscous, more like oil, less like water. And if your blood becomes more viscous, it's more like bacon grease than it is like water, then your heart has to push harder to get your blood moving. So that viscous blood raises your blood pressure too. Okay, so if I'm avoiding cheese and I'm avoiding meat, then I'm avoiding the sodium and my blood viscosity is dropping. So my blood pressure ought to fall, and voila, that's exactly what happens. But that's not all, because you're replacing it with fruits and vegetables. They have potassium instead of sodium. That brings your blood pressure down too. Okay, so all this was put together in a study that I've talked about here many times, but just as a quick reminder, the DASH study. It was conducted back in the 1990s, inspired by the observation that vegetarians and vegans had low blood pressure. They brought in 459 adults. The top line here is systolic blood pressure of people who made no changes. The second line is people who increased their vegetables and fruits. That's all they did. That improved their blood pressure. The third line, those are the people who increased vegetables and fruits, but also reduced meat and reduced fat. And you see their blood pressure drop best of all, and it dropped within about 2 weeks' time. The lower curves, that's diastolic blood pressure. So it helps both. It doesn't take long. Your blood pressure drops within about 2 weeks of doing this program. Now, the DASH program was sort of a semi-vegetarian approach. For the best results, make it vegan. Throw out the animal products altogether. That way, everything you're consuming is from a plant. You'll have the lowest risk of high blood pressure of anybody, the healthiest blood pressure, and you'll do best. So, plant-based foods, reduce salt, lace up your sneakers for exercise, be careful about alcohol and tobacco. Obviously, I didn't need to tell you that already. And so now you're thinking, hooray, I can throw my medications away. Not so fast. Do this only with medical supervision. The reason is high blood pressure is dangerous. And no matter how great you may feel, you can't feel your blood pressure. And high blood pressure is a problem. So I do hope you'll change your diet, let your doctor know you're doing it, get checked. And when your blood pressure comes down, your doctor will help to bring you down off your medications when the time is right. Back to you, Chuck.
All right, Dr. Barnard, I appreciate that. You know, thinking back to high blood pressure, I still remember back in high school when I was put on high blood pressure medication, and it was due to this enormous amount of sodium that I was eating just from fast food every single day. Never really was a big fan of Velveeta, the cheese that's not cheese that you were talking about, but it's so easy in that standard American diet for us to overdose on salt, wouldn't you say?
I would. And by the way, I think many people might have exactly the same reaction. They'll say, well, Velveeta is not really cheese. Let me tell you something. When you can fly next, go to France, rent a car, and go to the village of Camembert. and say, I want your most organic, natural cheese that you have. And I want to tell you something. It's loaded with sodium too. Cheeses always are. I don't care where it's made. I don't care if it's organic or not organic. Salt is an integral part of cheese making. It's always high in salt. Throw it out.
All right, Dr. Barnard, stick around because we have a lot of questions headed your way when we open up the doctor's mailbag in just a little bit. So if you have a question for Dr. Barnard, go ahead and post it in the comment section right now. We will do our best to answer as many of your questions as we can by the end of the show. But first, let's talk about obesity. For those of you who didn't know, I used to weigh 420 pounds. I weigh 140 today, but at my heaviest, I had a 66-inch waist and wore a size 6XL shirt. And you may have heard me also refer to myself as the weight loss champion. That was a name given to me actually by an NFL player after he heard about my story. So I wear it kind of with a badge of honor. And while the majority of the weight that I lost came before I went vegan, I will say that eating a plant-based diet is what has helped me keep it off. There's no question about it. And it's also a bigger part of why I'm confident that that weight will never be coming back. So with that in mind, I am really excited to have my next guest on the show. She is here to show us how it is possible to lose weight and lower the risk of so many of the comorbidities associated with the worst cases of COVID-19. Yes, we're talking about weight loss amid all the stress of a global pandemic. And with that, we welcome dietitian Karen Smith to the Exam Room Live. Karen, a lot of people right now are turning to food for comfort. They're coping with stress through calories. So how can we break that cycle and actually trim down and get healthy as we're in this lockdown?
Yeah, great topic of discussion, Chuck. I have 10 tips that I think are great strategies to get people started. And first and foremost is to break up with bacon and cheese and chicken and eggs and just jump in and try a plant-based diet. The evidence is overwhelming that this is a great strategy for slimming your waistline and also for reducing your blood pressure, for preventing cancer, for reducing your risk of heart disease and diabetes down the road. And so just give it a try. My second strategy is to do what my shirt says and fill up on fruit. It might be one of the most frustrating topics that I come across as a dietitian in that many people are afraid to eat fruit. They've been told that it's not good for their blood sugar or that it will cause weight gain, and that is not evidence-based at all. And it's one of the best things you can do. And I feel like it's really simple because there are so many fruits that are portable and easy to grab and require no preparation. And so go for, as many fruits as possible. I say aim for a minimum of 4 to 5 daily. It's a great way to fill up your stomach for very few calories. Fruits are the second lowest foods in terms of calorie density at only 300 calories per pound. You really can't eat too many in a day, and they're packed full of nutrients.
As a quick refresher, can you remind people why eating fruit isn't going to spike your blood sugar the same way that a candy bar would?
Yeah, I mean, fruit is packed full of antioxidants. It's full of fiber and a large amount of water as well. And, carbohydrates in the form of fruit and other whole plant-based foods are absolutely not the same as refined sugars. And so you don't get that spike in blood sugar that you get when you eat something like a candy bar or other refined foods.
Okay, what's next on your list?
What's next? So avoid or reduce oils. At 9 calories per gram, of packed into oil, right? Fat is the most calorie dense macronutrient. And it's really, really simple for many people to cut back on how much oil they use and see results in terms of their weight. And often I find just doing that, even people who might already be on a plant-based or vegan diet and maybe eating more processed foods or using oils to cook can often reduce weight pretty quickly when they take a look at how much oil they're using or how much oil is coming into the processed foods that they're consuming and cut back on them. So next is to focus on fiber. And you had a guest on last week, Dr. B, who had an awesome conversation about how important fiber is in terms of promoting really great gut health and what that does for your immune system. It's also a really great strategy for reducing weight. Fiber-rich foods really do take up a lot of space in your stomach. They help you feel full without added calories. So the most fiber-rich foods are foods that I would say you really can't overconsume. You can't eat too many vegetables in a day. You can't eat too many fruits. You can't eat too many beans or lentils or whole grains. And when I say whole grains, I'm talking about the grains that are in their form closest to nature, preferably. So things like oats and barley and brown and wild rice and quinoa. Certainly more refined whole grains like a whole wheat bread or whole wheat crackers, things along those lines, still are going to give you some fiber, but because they've been refined, they're much, much more calorie dense. So usually about 3 times more calorie dense than those whole grains when they're in their form closest to nature. My next tip is to eat your veggies first. So in particular, your non-starchy vegetables, coming from Dr. Greger's great book, How Not to Diet. If you fill up your plate with lots of vegetables, for example, broccoli, green beans, a big salad packed full of greens, carrots, cucumbers, you name it, that will automatically just reduce the number of calories that you take in after you eat those vegetables. And so you're really filling your stomach with really nutrient-dense foods first and not even noticing that you're eating less of the foods that follow. So it's something simple that you can do and boost your fiber intake and get even more vegetables, which is also a great strategy for reducing your blood pressure. My next strategy is to move your body every single day. Not just because you're going to burn calories that way, but exercise, physical activity is one of the best things you can do for your mental health and for improving mood and reducing signs and symptoms of depression and anxiety. And so personally, you know, it's something that I practice every day and know that when I'm in a better state mood-wise, when I feel happier, when I feel better about myself, it's so much easier to make healthier food choices and stick with my food plan for the day. Next, I recommend committing to doing just one thing or maybe 2 things that are really specific and can be easily measured. So for example, maybe you're not currently eating plant-based and you're thinking that this sounds like a great idea. And you're not sure, you know, if you can commit to eating 3 meals a day being plant-based, but maybe 2 sounds super doable. That's an awesome strategy and something that at the end of the day, you can just answer yes or no. Did I eat 2 entirely plant-based meals today? Yes or no. So when you're committing to doing something that can be easily tracked like that, it's easy to measure and really understand like how the strategies you're implementing are impacting your progress and then change your plan along the way. I think it's also important to get support. So whether it's someone at home, a friend, a colleague, a family member who doesn't live with you, reaching out to someone and explaining what you're doing and having like a buddy on this journey is so important. Or if I can selfishly plug, you know, myself and other Food for Life instructors out there who are teaching classes online right now, being in a community of people who are doing the same thing as you and who want to improve their health and change their diets can make a really huge difference in your success and your sticking to the changes that you're making. So get a buddy, find a support group. It can make a huge difference. Have a meal plan and have a meal plan that's yours and not somebody else's. So I often recommend that people just sit down at nighttime and think about what their plan is for the next day. You don't necessarily have to plan out, you know, your meals for the next 2 weeks, the next month, but just taking a couple of minutes to think about what you're going to be doing the next day, what foods you have on hand, and writing it out can be so effective at helping you stick to that plan. When you don't have any plan at all, it's just so much easier to really make all kinds of choices that you don't feel that great about and that aren't going to help you lose the weight that you want to lose. And lastly, I think it's so important for people to be kind to themselves in the way that they talk to themselves and in their food choices. So often we find ourselves talking to ourselves really negatively. And I'll often encourage people to kind of take a step back and think about their self-talk and pretend that they're talking to like their best friend. And Chuck, you might want to chime in here because I've not ever lost, a huge amount of weight like you have, but I've struggled with binge eating in the past. And I know that there was that self-talk of, oh, you can't do this, or just take that one more bite. You can go outrun what you eat later. And, understanding or thinking about like, oh, if that was my friend in that situation, what would I tell that person was really helpful for me. How about you?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head with so many things, but also let's keep in mind that when you beat yourself up, then what do? You turn to the things that make you feel better. And for so many of us, that comfort comes from food. So it's really then a vicious cycle. That negative talk, that negative headspace puts you right back, in my case, at the drive-through, and then you eat your feelings, and then you're right back to where you started, and that negative talk continues. And so really you get yourself trapped. So you're absolutely right. A positive mindset is so critical when moving forward. And I will also say that support component is super important. Yeah, we need to rely on ourselves more than anybody else, right? You need to believe in yourself to show yourself that you can do it. And believe me, you can. But to have that support system just so you can kind of share what worked for you, what didn't work for you, and have somebody to pick you up when you are having those negative talks with yourself, that is so critically important. So Karen, thank you so much for those 10 tips. And I'm sure that viewers have some questions about some maybe specific foods for weight loss, or they want to get a little bit more nerdy about nutrition. So stick around, because I want for you to join Dr. Barnard and I when we open up the doctor's mailbag and take all kinds of questions. You're going to have some really keen insight there. So I'm looking forward to bringing you aboard for that. But before we get to that, I also want to ask you about your new Food for Life class. You mentioned that you're teaching courses as a Food for Life instructor, but you have one now specific for COVID-19 called Cooking to Combat COVID-19. What can your students expect to learn with that?
Yeah, they're going to learn great strategies for increasing fiber, as I said earlier, and adopting a plant-based diet in that supportive group setting. The same foods that Dr. Barnard and I have mentioned, eating more fruits, more vegetables, more beans, and how these foods are so beneficial for helping your immune system really be in good shape to fight off an infection if presented with one.
All right, super important. And if you want to register for a class, you can head to fflclasses.org. That's FFL is in Food for Life, classes.org. That's where you can go ahead and find Karen and a whole bunch of other great instructors there that are ready to help school you up in the middle of this pandemic. But right now, it is time to open up the doctor's mailbag and answer some of your questions. And I want to welcome Dr. Barnard back to the show as we do that. So if you have a question, go ahead and post it in the comment section right now, or you can hit us up on social media at Chuck Carroll, WLC, or at PCRM on Twitter. Just make sure that you use the hashtag Exam Room Podcast. Dr. Barnard, the first question comes to us from Allison, wonderful supporter of the show. She's been watching and she has a follow-up to our discussion on cigarettes and vaping. She writes, what do you make of the French study that infected smokers are less likely to develop symptoms, and if they do develop them, are actually more likely than non-smokers to have symptoms that are mild? Interesting study.
Great question, and thank you for submitting that question, Allison, and also thank you so much for your support of what we're doing here at the Exam Room. The study you're talking about, it got a lot of press through The Economist, and about 25% of French adults are smokers, according to recent surveys. And what they reported was among people who were hospitalized or in serious outpatient treatment with COVID-19, only maybe 4 or 5% of them were smokers. So the thought was smoking is going to help you. And things went a little bit further. Nicotine was suddenly the possible benefit. And the idea is that when the virus is inhaled, it arrives at that ACE2 enzyme that I mentioned earlier. And that's what allows it then to get sucked into the cell. That's the welcome mat. And there has been some reporting that maybe nicotine will attach to that very same receptor and block the virus from attaching. That's the hope. Well, there's a couple things wrong with that. First of all, the study was a small study. It was really quite an uncontrolled study. And the researchers themselves raised the question, well, these people are coming into the hospital and they might be saying they're a non-smoker, but maybe they just quit recently. And maybe even some smokers didn't want to admit that they were smoking. So they were a little bit skeptical of their own data. But also, to tell you the truth, what has worried me even more is that there was an article in the Journal of Medical Virology in April 15th, I think it came out. And they looked at 11 different studies of smokers, put them all through a meta-analysis. And what they found was frightening. Smokers had double the risk of a serious infection. And if you had COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is typically caused by a lengthy smoking career, the risk of a bad infection, a very symptomatic infection or a deadly infection, was increased fourfold. So the best evidence we have is that if you don't smoke, this is not a reason to start. If you do smoke, this is probably a good reason to quit. And what researchers are going to do, though, is they're going to follow up this nicotine connection by testing whether nicotine administered not through cigarettes, but through patches or pills is helpful. So the very same people then who are hoarding hydroxychloroquine are now going to start hoarding nicotine. So stay tuned.
It's amazing to me the just incredible amount of research that's being done that's tied to COVID-19. Like, I never thought that there would be a study specific to smoking and whether or not it's actually beneficial, but here we are. Next question is actually for Karen. This person writes in, is there an acceptable amount of vegetable oil that we can safely consume each day? Karen, what do you think?
A safe amount? I'm not sure what the upper limit is. I look at it this way. So they're certainly not necessary for good health by any stretch. You don't need to be using oil to have really great health. And so in my opinion, the least amount that you can use is the best amount. And depending on your health conditions, for somebody who's looking to reverse type 2 diabetes, reverse heart disease, then less or none is my recommendation. If you're someone who's in really good health and doesn't have any of those chronic health conditions, you can get away with having a little bit more oil, recognizing that it is really calorie dense. I know personally, like, it's just something that has been easy to not cook with at all. I don't miss it. And, many of the women that I work with, in my same age category, in their 40s, have this trend of gaining weight. I've not experienced that. And I think, perhaps if I still was using oil, maybe that would be different. I don't know.
All right. Dr. Barnard, coming to you next. This is an interesting one. We talk so much about diabetes on the show. This comes to us from Tammy. She writes, I've been eating a low-fat, whole food, plant-based diet for 3 years, and in the last 18 months, my insulin went from 4.5 to 16.2, but my A1C is still in the normal range. Any idea why?
Okay. You said your insulin went up, and I guess I'm not sure if you're talking about an insulin dose that you were taking, or if you're talking about your insulin, your blood insulin level. I'm guessing you might be talking about the amount of insulin in your bloodstream. And if that has gone up, first, I'm a little surprised that your doctor would test that, but if your doctor did, there's really two reasons why insulin can go up. The acute reason is, as you already know, sugar will make your insulin level rise, and carbohydrate will too, briefly. And so if you have something sugary, your body makes insulin, goes into the blood to store that sugar. But here's a surprise. Protein will also raise insulin. It's another maybe less known property of insulin. Insulin will go into the bloodstream, and if you've been consuming a lot of protein, your body will then take that protein, put it in the cells, by using insulin to do that as well. So the point being that if your diet is high in protein, high in sugar, your body will make more insulin. The more important issue, though, really, and the more long-lasting issue is fat getting into your blood, into your muscle cells and liver cells. Fat comes from the foods that you eat. So if you eat something fatty, oil, lard, bacon grease, your insulin level won't rise right away. And your blood sugar may not rise right away, but the fat gets into the cells, and the more fat that gets into the cells, then the more insulin resistant that cell becomes, and the more insulin your body then makes to try to overcome it. So the answer, get the fat out of your diet. Now, you mentioned that you're already following a pretty low-fat diet. The only thought I have is do a search and destroy on your diet. Look for a lot of nut products, seed products, guacamole, added oils, and that little bit of contraband for some people can make their insulin levels rise.
Contraband. Sticking with you, Dr. Barnard, this one comes to us from Andrea on YouTube. This is a really good question. What can I say to my doctor to help him update his knowledge about nutrition without sounding rude?
You know, it's a funny thing. Can you imagine if you went to a doctor and the doctor says you have a high cholesterol level, and you said, should I take a statin? And the doctor said, what's a statin? You know, I mean, you would march out the door. But you could say to a doctor, you know, the doctor says you got to have a high cholesterol level, and you say, maybe I should go vegan. And we just quite accept that doctors have no clue in so many cases about vegan diets. Now, I'm happy to tell you that is changing rapidly. And at our annual conference that we have here in Washington every year, by the way, this year it's going to be all 100% virtual. But it would just make your heart sing to see hundreds and hundreds and now thousands of doctors who are learning about this and do know about vegan diets. And so they hopefully won't make you angry. But here's what you could suggest to your doctor to kind of get him or her a little more clued in. We have a website called Nutrition CME, like continuing medical education. It's free. And doctors need CME. And I'm going to tell you a secret. This is 2020. December of 2020 is when doctors in most states have to renew their licenses, and so they need CME to do it. And so they're paying money for continuing medical education. This one is free. It's all plant-based. NutritionCME.org. One more resource, the Nutrition Guide for Clinicians. That's an app. It's on your iPhone. It's on your Android. You'll see it on the web. Nutrition Guide for Clinicians. Everything you need to know about nutrition.
Look at you peeling back the medical curtain. I had no idea. December 2020, that's the big one. Okay, so now is the time. Sticking with you, Dr. Barnard, from Darcy on YouTube, anything we can do to help horrible migraines? I get such horrible migraines every single month hormonally.
I am sorry to hear you're dealing with that. Wow. Yes. Well, first of all, let's make sure we all know what a migraine is. Everyone knows a migraine is a headache, but it's not a tension headache. Like, I'm having a bad day. I've got this diffuse pain. It'll go away in a half hour, 45 minutes. No, that's not a migraine. A migraine is a sledgehammer. It's hammering your brain, often one side, not always, but quite often it's one-sided, and it's throbbing, it's pulsing, and it's not quick. It can last overnight. You can have it all day tomorrow. And with it, you're often sick, nauseated, vomiting. You just feel rotten. Two real strategies here. One is, you mentioned that it comes cyclically every month, and I'm going to guess that this comes right around the time that your period is starting, somewhere in there, or maybe a couple of days before. You're having hormonal shifts, and this is something that Chuck, you and I talked about with my new book, Your Body in Balance. Let me mention to you in response to this question. Estrogen changes over the course of the month cause all kinds of problems, from routine menstrual cramps to worsening endometriosis, and over the long run, higher risk of breast cancer. So the key to getting that down, to getting estrogen down, is a high fiber diet. Fiber helps carry estrogens away. A low fat diet, because reducing fat brings estrogen levels down. Definitely avoid cheese. Cheese has estrogens in it. But if you put all this together, try this as an experiment for the next 2 or 3 months. No animal products at all. keep oils really low. That way it's very low fat, very high in fiber, and see if you don't do better. That calms down the estrogen storms, and maybe your migraines won't happen. For extra credit, we did a migraine study several years ago where we found that certain foods trigger migraines. And this is quite independent of the menstrual ones. It can happen any time of month. Dairy products, number one. And this is true for even low-fat dairy, skim dairy. Avoid it. Dairy products, eggs, meat can do it. But for some people, it's things like nuts, wheat, citrus fruits, tomatoes. These are unusual, but they can happen. And if you look in my book, The Cheese Trap, not to be promoting all my own books, but check it out of the library, in the very back of The Cheese Trap, because so many people have cheese-induced headaches, there is an elimination diet that you can try where you take all the triggers out of your diet, put them back in one at a time, and see which one or more than one triggers the pain. And then you got your culprit, then you avoid it, and hopefully you'll be headache-free. We've seen a lot of people cure their migraines using that kind of approach, and it's just changes your life.
All right. We spoke extensively about that in that podcast series that we did with your book. And as a matter of fact, I just got an email from a viewer the other day who was, she lives in Georgia, and she's like, as soon as the restrictions are lifted, you tell Dr. Barnard that we need one of those stops on that book tour to be right here in Georgia. So I'm doing my part. I'm telling you, Georgia would love to see you.
Well, if they're open now, all right. Let me get down to Atlanta. Yeah. We're going to help people eat in a more healthful way.
All right, Karen, this one comes to you. We've got time for just a couple more questions here, so post yours in the comment section right now. Karen, this one comes to us from Kathy on Facebook. She writes, how damaging is salt to our health? Should we give it up entirely?
I generally don't recommend that people cut it out entirely. It is can contribute to hypertension. It also is inflammatory. The great thing about adopting a whole food plant-based diet is that you're eating foods that are really naturally low in sodium to begin with. And so having a little bit of sodium generally is okay, like less than 2,000 milligrams a day. Some people need less than that, 1,500 milligrams or less, depending on their health conditions. And so if you're eating a whole food plant-based diet, it's easy to not exceed those amounts.
All right. Shifting back to COVID-19 now, Dr. Barnard, this one comes to us from Virginia. She writes, is it possible the farmed animals are being infected with the virus, and how will people who eat them be affected? What I strongly suspect, is that farm animals may pick it up, but they will probably throw it off. When I speak of farmed animals, I'm thinking about pigs and cows. With chickens, frankly, the jury is still out on all of these ones, but let me hedge on chickens and ducks and geese, only because we've seen viruses go through poultry farms like crazy and then become transmissible animal to animal. What I'm more worried about, frankly, are the COVID-infected humans who work in the slaughterhouses. As they're killing the animals, I'm concerned that the COVID can be airborne. They're sneezing, they're coughing, they're shoulder to shoulder, and they may well be wrapping up the virus along with the pork chop. It can last on these surfaces for long enough to end up at your local Kroger's or Publix or Safeway. So I think that's the bigger issue, probably. I'm less concerned about a live animal picking it up. All right. This question comes to us from YouTube. Next to last one. This is from Heath. He writes, I was diagnosed with vitamin D deficiency and have been given a high dose of D2 supplements. Besides getting outside more, is there anything I can do to make sure that I'm absorbing as much as possible?
Okay, great question. First of all, you can get tested. When you get tested, for whatever reason, everybody turns out low, whether that's a lab artifact or you really are low, you certainly can supplement. I obviously work with your own doctor, but almost every caregiver is going to say supplement to about 2,000 international units a day. You're using D2. That's perfectly effective. That will work. Some people favor D3 and will say it has a slightly better absorption. There is such a thing as vegan D3. If it's not specifically labeled as vegan, it actually came, believe it or not, from wool. It's in the lipid on the sheep's coat, And one of the many creative things people have figured out to do is to extract vitamin D from sheep's wool, not your favorite source. So you can get D3, you can get vegan D3, but I doubt that will be dramatically different from D2. So what else can you do? If you're overweight, losing weight helps. We talked about this on yesterday's program. Vitamin D tends to get soaked up into body fat. When you lose weight, the vitamin D is liberated back into circulation. And do get sunlight, 20 minutes a day on your face and arms if you can. If you cannot do that, then supplementation is the name of the game.
All right. Final question is actually for both you, Dr. Barnard, and Karen. We're going to start with Karen. This one is from Emma on Facebook, and she writes, I feel like I'm addicted to bread. I can't stop eating it. What are some tips to help me stop overeating?
Great. Hi, Emma. Well, you can stop eating it. And so I'd suggest even maybe just changing what you're telling yourself. So you absolutely can if that's something that you want to do. And thinking about, what you would feel good about in terms of your bread consumption. Is it having less of it? Or is it setting it aside entirely for a certain amount of time? But for many people, it might be doing just that, taking a break from it for a little while. And I guess I'm curious to know more about what you're looking to achieve and the bread consumption and how you feel like not having it might benefit you. So you can do it if that's what you want to do. And so maybe having that mindset of knowing that it is something you can achieve, it might be helpful.
Dr. Barnard, we've spoken at length about food addiction, primarily about cheese addiction, and perhaps food addiction is kind of a similar thing no matter what food it is that we're talking about. What advice do you have for somebody who's struggling with food addiction?
I guess a couple things. First of all, it's not you. It's the food. The reason I say that is so many people will say, there's something wrong with me. I had a bad childhood. Well, yeah, we've all had childhood trauma and so forth. But in most cases, the reason that people get addicted to food is that there are laboratories run by the Chocolate Manufacturers Association and everybody else trying to figure out how to get you hooked on food. The dairy industry itself, actually, it's an amazing thing. 20 years ago, the dairy industry worked with the US government to pull together what they called the Cheese Forum, specifically to try to figure out how to get more Americans hooked on cheese. And they were wildly successful. And the trick was just to make sure that the cheese is high salt, high fat, of course, which they did already, but to make sure it was always there. On every menu, very prominently displayed so that it would trigger addictive behavior. And that can happen no matter who you are. So in other words, it's not you, it's the food and it's the marketing. Anybody can get food addicted. But let me come back to the bread issue that was just raised. 2 quick points. Typical breads are wheat breads. Wheat is a high glycemic grain, meaning it releases sugar fairly rapidly. Rye and barley are lower glycemic index foods. So let's say you go to the store and you get a rye bread. You'll notice that often they're blends of wheat and rye, and it will affect your blood sugar more gradually and make you feel satisfied longer. So you discover you're not digging into breads quite so much. But perhaps the most important thing is bread itself isn't a devil. I think Karen hinted at this earlier. Why do you want to stop eating it? I think the real issue is what's on your bread. If what's on your bread is salami and bologna and cheese, then that's really the bigger issue. If what's on your bread is low-fat hummus or some veggie slices, or make a CLT, that's a cucumber, lettuce, and tomato sandwich with a little mustard or something like that, that's an okay sandwich. So I wouldn't beat yourself up about having that.
I would love to talk more about food addiction on another show, because just thinking back, I just remember when I was still addicted to fast food, it was like a switch would get flipped if I didn't get it, even for one single day. And I just became this jerk. It was a total Jekyll and Hyde situation. So I empathize so much with what Emma was saying. So let's come back to that on a future show. But I want to thank everybody for their comments today, your questions. They were fantastic. If we didn't get to it today, don't worry. Keep posting it in the comments comment section. We will add it to the queue, and hopefully we can get you some answers on a future broadcast. Before we go, though, I want to remind you about a very special episode of the Exam Room podcast, the audio version, that is coming out tomorrow morning, and that is my conversation with Dr. Michael Greger. Had a chance to speak with him as he was actually walking on his treadmill. Okay, this is a 25-minute walk and talk. So it was all about how to survive a pandemic. What should we be doing? What should we be eating? Tons of nutrition facts and a ton of fun. So that conversation comes out tomorrow morning. Just head over to Apple Podcast or Spotify or Stitcher. Look for the Exam Room podcast by the Physicians Committee. Hit that subscribe button and leave a 5-star rating. And when you leave that 5-star rating, you're actually making the world a healthier place, because you're helping us climb in the rankings. And the higher we climb in the rankings, the easier it becomes for somebody who truly needs this life-saving, potentially life-changing information. It pops right up there for them on Apple Podcast and on Spotify. So hit that subscribe button and leave a 5-star rating and do your part to please help us make the world a healthier place. And if you're in the market for a plant-based doctor or dietitian, you are in luck, my friend. I know a lot of you are, based off of those questions today. The Barnard Medical Center is now accepting new patients and offering virtual visits right on your computer. You don't even have to leave your house to schedule an appointment. Take charge of your health. Visit barnardmedical.org or call 202-527-7500. That number and web address is up on the screen right now, barnardmedical.org or 202-527-7500. New patients being accepted in California, New York, Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia, Missouri, Arizona, Colorado, or Massachusetts. If you live in any of those states, call and make your appointment today. They would love to get you on a healthier track. And dietitian Lee Crosby from the BMC, she's going to be on the show tomorrow right here with super easy ways to help eat healthy on a budget. She's got her top 8 cheap eats. So that is here on Facebook and YouTube at noon Eastern. So make an appointment at Barnard Medical Center and then make another appointment to join us right back here tomorrow. But for today, that is all the time that we have. Thank you so very much for joining us. On behalf of Dr. Neal Barnard and Karen Smith, I am the weight loss champion, Chuck Carroll. Have yourself a healthy Wednesday. Talk to you tomorrow.